Hello, it is a real privilege to be able to share with you today and to share as part of this series on resources. I want us today to imagine, if you would, for a moment, that all of the resources that you hold in your hands are like this cake. The resources that you have might be a whole host of things: your abilities, your skills, your time, your contacts, your house, a whole set of things that you may have, and they will vary depending upon who we are. But I think we often approach life as if it was a cake to be divided. And depending upon our priorities, we'll divide up our time and our energy and our resources in different ways. So if you or I are fortunate enough to have a job, a huge slice of our energy and our resources will go into our work. In fact, it might be the biggest and the greatest slice of resources. And then we want to put energy and time into our families and into our friends. We might use resources of hospitality, of parenting, of friendship, skills and abilities that we have. You might have the ability to listen. And so we slice up the cake. There might be time then for hobbies. Many people in our church have the most amazing gifts, whether it's carpentry or quilting, whether it's hiking, a whole host of things that they put time and energy and their resources into. So there we have another slice. Those of us who are Christians then want to give some of our energy and resources to God. And so we cut out a slice for church on a Sunday. It's a bit of a smaller slice at the moment because we don't have to travel to church. We sit in the comfort of our home. Then we might have a slice for small group and a tiny slice left maybe to volunteer in some capacity. And then, well, I really want to spend time with God each day, but you know what? All that's left are these crumbs. We're going to come back to the cake later. The reading that we heard Vienna read today comes from 1 Chronicles and is part of a prayer of King David. And in this prayer, I think we see 3 amazing attitudes that he had towards his resources. I want us to look at those 3 attitudes. But before we do that, what led up to this prayer? See, David had begun life as a shepherd boy, and here he is as a king with a kingdom. In order to get to that point, he'd had to go on a long journey and work incredibly hard. He'd had to fight many battles, and he'd shown himself to be a wise military leader. He'd had to show courage, and he'd had at times to hide for his life. He had stayed close to God. Yes, there'd been times when he'd sinned and he'd needed to seek God's forgiveness, but he'd done that. And he remained close to God, to a point where he's described as a man after God's own heart. It had been a long, hard journey for David. But now he finds himself with a capital city in Jerusalem and living in a palace. But at that time, they believed and knew God's presence with them, represented in the Ark of the Covenant, which was housed in a tent that the people had carried round with them through their wanderings in the wilderness. The Ark of the Covenant was still held within a tent. And David said, "Why should I be living in this palace?" He says, "Here I am living in a house of cedar, while the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord is under a tent." And so he determines that he's going to build the most amazing temple in the world. And in it, God's presence will dwell. He is so excited about this project. But then through the prophet Nathan, God speaks to him and says to him, "David, this is not your project to build. It's your son Solomon. It's his task when he's king to build the temple." At that point, David could so easily have said, well, if I'm not going to be part of the exciting bit of building the actual temple, I'll just go and rest in my palace. But no, he decides that he will commit and use all the resources at his disposal, and in fact collect as many more as he can, in order that Solomon will have everything he needs at his disposal to build the most amazing temple. And so he sets about using his gifts of planning and strategy to write up the most amazing plans. There are job descriptions for all the different roles that people will fulfill within the temple. And he collects materials. So as soon as Solomon is ready, the materials, the people, the plans will be in place. He leads by example. He not only takes, as it were, from the nation, but from his own personal resources. And as he gives generously, so he encourages the people to bring of what they could to the work of the temple. The people respond, and they bring their resources, and they gather before David. And as he surveys all that has been given, so he breaks out into this amazing prayer. And the first thing that I see in this prayer is an attitude of humility. David could so easily have said, haven't I done well? I've done such an amazing job that will enable me to provide all these resources for the temple. Aren't we good? But no, he looks to God and acknowledges that all things come from God. The last verse that we heard read, he says this, "Who am I? And who are my people that we should be able to give as generously as this? Everything comes from you, and we have given you only what comes from your hand." David knows that all that he has is only because God has given it. And so his whole prayer is one of thanksgiving. God, you have given us these resources that we're able to give. David gives with a humility. Secondly, he gives with a generosity. The amounts that are listed in the chapter before are huge. The amount of wood and precious stones, the detail of the plans that must have taken generous amounts of time. David doesn't want to hold back from giving to God the very best. And thirdly, David, I think, has an attitude in which he gives with expectation of what God will do when we hand him resources. David's expectation was that this temple was going to be beautiful. It was going to be amazing, and the presence of God would dwell there. And you know, God answered that vision and exceeded it. It says that when the temple was completed, and Solomon, David's son, stands to lead this huge service, that actually the people and the priests had to stop what they were doing. They couldn't enter the temple because the presence of God came down in such an amazing way that they were stopped still in their tracks. God's presence was with them. David gave with humility. David gave with a generosity. And David gave with an expectation of what God could do when he offered his resources. Back to viewing our resources like a cake. Now, the observant among you will notice that I'm now holding a cake that's larger than the one I started with. And that's because I believe that sometimes we feel like we have very little to offer, but we always have more resources than we think in the economy of God. I think that's partly because rather than viewing one slice as God's slice of resources, actually, if we're going to follow the model of King David, a model that I believe is a godly attitude to resources, so we view all of this cake as belonging to God. He has given to each of us resources, rather than feeling like we just have the crumbs to offer him at the end of a week when we're exhausted. No, each of us has a huge amount of resources that God has given to us. Time and energy, our personality, our gifts, our skills. And so we begin each day with a very different outlook. We begin each day saying, in humility, God, all that you have given to me comes from you. So how do you want me to use it? How do you want me to use my resources? Now, the truth is that we end up doing very similar things. We need to divide up the cake, our energy and our time, but each part of it is us using our resources to serve and honour God. So the slice that is work and my job, God, how do you want me to use the gifts in my job to serve you? My ability to manage people, or my ability to listen in the office, my ability to understand figures and numbers. How do I use that for you, to honour you? In our families and friends, the resources that we have to build friendships, to bless, to welcome the lonely. Each of these slices is an offering to God with the resources that we have, and we find that actually the resources keep going because God equips us again and again. We come with an attitude of humility. God, how do you want me to use my gift of organisation? Is it in running a household? Is it in serving in a volunteer capacity for a charity that needs help? We give with humility. Secondly, we approach our giving with generosity because we don't hold back, because we acknowledge it's God's. It's His. And the amazing thing is that He cares for us. So He knows what we need for our daily sustenance. He knows the rest we need. He knows our capacity. I was so blessed last week by somebody who had the resource of a car that was large. They had the resource of time and a willingness to transport random bits of furniture around the city for me. I texted and said, is there any chance you could do one of these journeys? And before I knew it, they'd picked up their car keys and they were on my drive with their car. What a blessing. How do we serve? I'm also aware that in the current circumstances, some of the ways that we've used our gifts are not possible. Those who have that great gift of hospitality and open their homes to lots of people and feed them are currently not able to use that as a resource. And so we're having to think creatively. If I have that bit of extra time that I can't kind of cook a huge meal for a great group of people, can I deliver some food to someone and bless them? Can I pick up the phone and listen to somebody? How am I using my resources during this time? And finally, as we offer all of our resources back to the God who gave them to, so we do it with expectation. For He is the God who takes our resources and does way beyond our expectations with them. King David was planning for the building of a temple in which the presence of God could dwell. Now, through Jesus' death and resurrection and the gift of the Holy Spirit, the presence of God dwells with each one of us as we call Jesus Lord and receive His Spirit. And so our prayer is that our resources would go into the building of God's kingdom, that more and more people in our homes, in our families, in our city, in our nation and beyond would know the love and grace of God. And as we offer our resources, so God takes them, and I believe will use them in the most amazing way. We're going to spend a few moments in prayer. And I'm going to ask that God would come by His Holy Spirit and fill each one of us afresh. You might want to hold out your hands as you prepare to receive a gift. And as that Holy Spirit refills, or maybe fills for the first time, we can ask God that question: what are the resources that you've given to me? And how do you want me to be using them at this point in time? Am I using my resources in ways that honour you and build your kingdom?